Hello everyone, welcome to your next section. In this one we're going to be talking about proper practices for when you're writing Python code. This is called style guidelines. So every language has its own kind of like universally accepted ways in which you should write code in order to make it clean, organized, and understandable by everyone. So this is an optional class and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of like the most common things that are really important for when building your style guidelines. We're not going to spend, an hour going through this. I'm just going to highlight some of the really important common ones and give you some general tips and advice. So in this class, you're going to learn proper practices for writing Python code, the conventions that you should be using when dealing with white space, how long your indentations are, how many characters a line should be, etc., etc. We're going to learn how to essentially make your code look clean and professional. So if you are strict on yourself and really apply these guidelines as important as fastidiously as possible, you're essentially going to be able to make your code look really good for potential employers. They're going to be very impressed, and it makes your code just easier to use for everyone, including yourself. So this is an optional class, but it's also a really important one that often gets missed. I mean, heck, even sometimes I don't apply proper style guidelines. So this is a forever process. You should always be trying to make your code look more clean and adhering to current conventions with reading code. So what are some of our definitions for this class? First, we're going to talk about what style guidelines are. They're just basically like a document that a bunch of people that use a coding language got together to say, okay, well, this is what we think makes this code more easy to read than this code over here. They are practices that are designed specifically to make your code look like everyone else's, and also designed to kind of read logically and with a flow that is generally appreciated and respected from the community. This last point here, PEP 8, this is the documentation, this is the style guidelines for Python. We're only going to go through a handful of important guidelines, but there are some that you might want to look at that currently I'm not going to in this class. So we're just going to spend most of our time talking about some high-level important ones that, that should be established no matter what. So we're not going to have a syntax section, guys, because this is all about syntax. We're really just going to jump into code, our little Jupyter notebook here, and we're going to spend time kind of looking at what each of these little concepts mean and spend one line at a time saying, okay, well, this is what the style guidelines say you should do in these cases. So with that, let's just jump into our Jupyter notebook. Okay, everyone, so here are some of our rules for proper style guidelines in Python. So first and foremost, indentation ideally should be 4 spaces long. You should use indents, which are with the tab button, not the space button. So you shouldn't be doing space, 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 space. You should be hitting tab. You can set indentation parameters in text editors anywhere you go. If it's not a totally big deal if, let's say, you're on a computer that indents with 2 spaces and you don't want to go through all the hassle of removing it or changing it. Like, just do what works for you. But Python guidelines say it should be 4 spaces. The longest a line should ever be is 79 characters long. So if you end up having a really long function, you should break that function down into separate lines so it's easier to read. This function will actually run just fine, even though you've entered. The syntax is designed and the user interface kind of accommodates for that and puts it in the proper space because it's reading what you're doing. When it comes to white space conventions, if you have an operator, you should always space between it. So we have a variable here, then we add a space before the equal sign, and then we add a space for 1 plus 2 and so on. So this is the proper namespace convention when dealing with like objects and operators. This is improper practice. Even though this is more condensed, it's harder to read. And as your operators, your variables, and your operators get more complicated, all that condensing, it makes it very difficult to handle and understand. The proper white space convention when dealing with logic is the same thing. So we have a space, we have to have a space in between if, because otherwise it doesn't know what it is. But we have our logic operator here, and it's space between these two. We don't add a space for colons. That is considered improper style guideline practices for Python. So make sure that colon, once your statement has been complete, it's like a period at the end of a sentence. We have our indentation here of 4 spaces as well. Now note that even though we said that operations should have spaces, if we have different groups of objects together, like these things in parentheses, these should be reduced in white space because this is a group of things put together. So consequently, A times B or C or something like that. You would want to keep you would want to not have white space for like groups of operations that are going on like this. However, you do have white space in between these different sets of observations. When it comes to importing, you can technically import multiple things at the same time by using a comma. That's considered bad practice. You should always be importing one line at a time. And it's just considered proper convention. It does literally nothing to damage your code. It's just a guideline. So it's designed to just say, okay, these are what we say you should do, even though you don't have to. The next thing I want to go into, guys, is talking about variable naming conventions. So there's a little bit here. There are basically 3 types of naming conventions that you should be following. You should either be using something like the lowercase letters, everything's lowercase, and then you have underscores in between variable names, like in variable words, lowercase with underscores, uppercase only, or mixed type where there is no underscores between them. So you start with like a lowercase, and then each word has a higher casing afterwards. I prefer the mixed type personally, and you'll find that most people that are working in JavaScript or something to that effect, a lot of people use this mixed naming convention. So personally, that's what I use. There are some exceptions when you should be using uppercase with underscores. For instance, if you have a constant in your file that's like, okay, this is just used all the time everywhere for a bunch of different functions, they should always be in all caps and with an underscore. However, basically everything else, naming functions, naming variables within functions, all of that kind of stuff, you can use either any of these 3 conventions, with the caveat that you maintain these conventions throughout the rest of your code. You shouldn't be using a mixed type for one function and a lowercase with underscores for another. Same with variable names. Stick to one. Stick to consistency where you can. The only time that should be violated is when you have things like constants, which are kind of like highlighting that these are important variables. I usually don't like to make anything with uppercase with underscores unless it's something like that, because it's like loud to my eyes, if you understand what I mean. Lastly, when we're dealing with functions, the first variable in a function, if you're creating one of these, should by convention be labeled as self, and that's because of how functions work. So you should label it as self or like CLS, I believe, but most people use self in that convention. As we were saying here with our variables, we should always be maintaining convention with our functions. So it's like, it should be mixed or lowercase, and always maintain that way for functions and variables, as I said before. Lastly, on comments, what we see here is that all comments should be in complete sentences. So you shouldn't have something that's broken English that someone doesn't understand. If a comment is there, it should be very informative. It shouldn't make your user more confused. There's nothing. The only thing worse than a commented-less code base is a commented code base that is deceiving or confusing the person that is reading it. It's incoherent in some way. So with that, we usually suggest that you use inline comments sparingly. You shouldn't be doing inline comments for everything. What we mean by an inline comment is like here, this is a constant. And that's it's inline as opposed to kind of like summarizing what's going to happen following it. And that the reason is for that basic reason. Essentially, your comment should be very terse. They should be complete sentences, complete ideas, but every line of code should not be explaining what's going on. So you want to like reduce the amount of noise that is in your writing and in your text file. So you want things that are really guiding both your own logic and the logic of others. And that's an art to make good good comments in code. But if someone says that your comments or your code are really good and they were really helpful and useful, that's an excellent skill, and you should be proud of that and maintain that, and always be looking towards improving how well you comment your code as you become a greater professional. Okay, guys, that's all I really wanted to touch on for style guideline stuff. We just wanted to do it briefly. There's a lot more that you can look at, but these are the things that come up all the time when it comes to style guidelines. So let's move into our recap. So what did we learn today, guys? We learned about style guidelines and like how coding languages usually want you to write out the code in a very specific way, so that other people that read this stuff all the time know what they're expecting when they're reading it. It becomes much easier to read if everyone writes in the same way. It also makes your code look a lot more clean and professional. So when somebody looks at your code, they're not just like, I don't understand what's going on. Even if it all runs just fine, because you're writing in such a strange way that most people don't look at code that way, and it's taxing to the eyes. So by doing this, your code looks really professional. And then we learned some conventions that also, like, these conventions are also designed to help you and make your coding experience a lot easier. So like uppercasing your constants is a good idea to make your code easier to understand and organize. So we learned that these conventions are useful for more than just like other people reading them. It's also to keep yourself organized. So with that, guys, thank you very much, and I'll see you next class.